This is lecture 15b. So last time I talked about the sort of dissolution of the Abbasid Caliphate and how the Mongols finally knocked it off, but then when the Mongols suddenly retreated, it left a power vacuum in the Middle East. And one of the people to take advantage of that power vacuum was a Turkish leader named Osman, no relation to Donnie and Marie. He was born under the Mongols, right? He was born just about the time that the Mongols crushed the Abbasid Caliphate. But the Mongols began to pull back out of Anatolia, or rather, although they crushed the Turks in the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongols never really asserted complete control over Anatolia. There was always a place in northern Anatolia that was not under the control of either the Byzantines or the Mongols. And so into this expanse, Turkish raiders could still operate freely, and Osman was one of these Turkish raiders. He was sort of a military leader. He had a bunch of guys around him, and he would raid the Byzantine Empire. And he began to control a really small chunk of territory in northwestern Anatolia, not too far from Constantinople on the Black Sea. And he basically was just one of dozens of these sorts of small military leaders, but his family was very fortunate. They married really well. They consolidated some alliances with other Turkish groups through marriages, and they worked out really well. And then he also got lucky with some military victories that allowed him to expand and become bigger than any of his neighbors, these other small little Turkish kingdoms. And so he began to expand more significantly, because once you get a little bit bigger, then it's easier to conquer some of your neighbors and become even bigger. And then a really big break came in the 1380s when in the Byzantine Empire there was a civil war. Basically, there were two claimants to be the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and one of them asked Osman's successors in the so-called Ottoman Empire for help. And so the Ottomans then moved an army across the Sea of Marmara and into Europe, and they began to fight against the Byzantines over there in southeastern Europe. And once that civil war was settled, the Ottomans held on to some of that territory. This gave them a foothold in Eastern Europe, and so they began to sort of expand around the Byzantine Empire. They're actually starting to encircle the Byzantine Empire. Well, this comes to a head in 1453 when Mehmet the Conqueror, armed with cannons, and I'll talk about cannons later, but Mehmet the Conqueror, who is the Ottoman Sultan, armed with cannons, besieges Constantinople and blows holes in the walls and takes Constantinople and ends the Byzantine Empire. Well, this now, so now the Ottoman Turks have conquered a big chunk of Anatolia, a chunk of southeastern Europe, and they've knocked off the Byzantine Empire. Well, now they can expand farther up into Europe, but they also can expand after about this time. The Mongols are gone, and so now there's this power vacuum over towards Mesopotamia, Persia, Syria, etc. And it's here, and it's really after 1500 that the Ottomans really expand rapidly. So once the Mongols are gone, the Ottomans begin to take advantage of this power vacuum. And I'm going to go a little bit beyond the end of the course just to give you the Ottoman picture. Selim I and then Suleiman the Magnificent, two Ottoman sultans in the early 1500s, Selim would invade Syria and conquer Syria and Palestine, and then and get down to Egypt. And then Suleiman the Magnificent would not only expand the Ottoman Empire all the way across North Africa to Morocco, he would also expand up into the Balkans and push Ottoman's territories all the way up to Vienna. He besieges Vienna in 1529. He gets stopped at the gates of Vienna, but basically he's conquered all of what we would, the Ottomans now control all of what we today call, Greece and Serbia and Croatia and Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary so this is a big chunk of territory that they control, and they would also push eastward toward Persia, but there they would run into a new Persian empire called the Safavid Empire. But underlying the expansion of the Ottomans, especially from the early 1400s onwards, is gunpowder, right? The Ottoman Empire, along with the Sultanate of Delhi and the Safavid Empire, are collectively called by historians the gunpowder empires because they expand very rapidly in the late 1400s and the early 1500s because they're the early adopters of these new weapons called cannons. Right? Now I talked a little bit about, China invented gunpowder and they invented some gunpowder weapons, but they never really invented a really powerful cannon. The Mongols used gunpowder weapons in some ways, but they weren't really very effective. But then in the mid-1300s, Europeans and the Ottomans, it really perfected cannons. And this allowed, cannons were important because first of all, cannons can blow holes in fortress walls, right? So suddenly if you're besieging a city, you can just blast the walls down. And second, cannons are kind of devastating on people also. But by the 1500s, you have handheld gunpowder weapons, and you have much more efficient cannons, and they're mounted on carriages, and you can aim them better, etc. And the Ottomans are one of the first groups to really use cannons as a military weapon on the battlefield, not just to blow holes in fortress walls, but to use it against enemy troops. And the Ottomans develop a really efficient artillery units to supplement their really good, cavalry units because they're Turks, they're great on the horseback, etc. So the Ottomans use these guns, and guns just totally change the nature of warfare because when you have cannons, you can wreak devastation on enemy cavalry in particular in ways you never could before. So it really undermines the power of the cavalry and expands the power of artillery. And so these new gunpowder empires, they expand very rapidly because they're fighting against people who don't have gunpowder. For instance, when the Ottomans get down to Egypt, they run into the Mamluks. Right? The Mamluks were these slave soldiers who had taken over Egypt. The Mamluks had stopped the Mongols cold in the mid-1300s. These guys were good. But when the Ottomans show up in the early 1500s, the Ottomans have guns and the Mamluks don't. They have bows and arrows. And it's not even a fair fight. The Ottomans just sweep them aside. And so gunpowder changes everything. And part of the reason, there's a lot of reasons this course stops at 1500. I mean, there's clearly with Columbus and connecting America and Europe, and then Europeans discovering sea routes around Africa. You definitely have a sense that after 1500 the world changes because it's connected in a way it never was before. But another thing is that after 1500 it's very common to have gunpowder armies, and this changes things also. So I just want you to keep gunpowder in mind as a really major thing going forward. And if you take History 112, the second portion of this, you'll see some of the effects of gunpowder. Just as a final note, I'll say that the Ottoman Empire would kind of stagnate in the 1600s, but it would survive until World War I. And it's only in about, I think it's 1921, that the Ottoman Empire is finally completely destroyed. And the Ottoman Empire was a major player in World War I. So the Ottoman Empire would actually last for 600 some years, which is really impressive. But in the next part of the lecture, I'm going to turn to sub-Saharan Africa. We haven't talked about it in a little while. I'm going to return and talk about that.